$80 billion. That was the price one man offered to buy his freedom from a cold steel cell. Arthur Vance stood at the very peak of the world, a titan of gold and grain who thought he was untouchable. But behind the silk suits and the billion-dollar smiles lay a trail of fire, sabotage, and a shadow that refused to stay buried. How did the King of Wall Street end up in a high-stakes game of life and death? Can a mountain of money truly wash away the blood of a rival, or would a single recorded whisper be the one thing that brings the empire crashing down? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking rise and the devastating fall of a man who had everything and lost it all. Please support our journey by subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Summit and the Abyss. 88 floors above the concrete veins of Manhattan. The air is thin, cold. Arthur Vance stands on the edge of his kingdom. Below him, the city is a mosaic of electric gold and pulsing neon. It is a view that cost him everything. His fingers, clad in the finest silk of a $10,000 suit, grip the cold marble railing. They are trembling in his left hand. A piece of paper feels heavier than all the gold in the world. It is a federal arrest warrant. It was delivered moments ago by his lead counsel, a man whose face was as pale as ash inside the penthouse. The music is a rhythmic pulse of cello and violin. The scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch hangs heavy in the air. Senators, CEOs, the architects of the modern world. They are all there, raising crystal flutes of vintage champagne, toasting to the man who built an empire from nothing, to the man who conquered the grain markets and the oil fields, to Arthur Vance, the living embodiment of the American dream. Then, the music stops, not with a fade, but with a violent silence. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open. The sound of combat boots on polished marble is like thunder. Federal agents in tactical gear flood the room, a sea of black vests and cold steel. The guests freeze. Champagne spills onto the white rug. A senator drops his glass. It shatters with a lonely, sharp sound. Arthur does not turn around immediately. He continues to look at the skyline, the city he thought he owned. The lead agent calls his name. It is a voice devoid of emotion. Arthur finally turns. His face is a mask of weary composure. He looks at the silver handcuffs glinting under the chandelier. He does not shout. He does not call his lawyers. He simply reaches into his inner pocket. He pulls out a weathered, tattered notebook. The edges are frayed. The leather is peeling. It is a relic of a life he tried to bury. I only wish to take this, he says. His voice is a low rasp. The agents hesitate. Then they nod. Outside the tower, the world is already screaming. Jumbotrons in Times Square flash the news in giant red letters. The $80 billion offer, rejected. The public is in shock. The man who offered to pay the national debt of a small country, the man who tried to buy his way out of judgment, is now being led out in chains. The federal court was clear. Justice is not a commodity. Some things, it seems, are not for sale. Arthur is led through the lobby. The cameras are waiting. Hundreds of flashes ignite at once. A strobe light of judgment. The white heat of the bulbs triggers a memory, a flash of a different kind. Rain, the smell of wet asphalt in the Bronx, a boy, small and shivering, hiding under a rusted fire escape. His stomach is a hollow ache. He is scavenging for bread crusts in a dumpster behind a bakery. His hands are stained with coal dust and hunger. He looks at the skyscrapers in the distance. He makes a silent promise to the dark sky. I will never be hungry again. The car door opens. Arthur steps into the back of the black sedan. The upholstery smells of leather and sterility. as the car pulls away. He looks out the window. A camera flash from a nearby journalist hits the glass. For a split second, the reflection disappears. In its place, he sees a different light, a terrifying orange glow. The night the Chicago factory burned. The screams were muffled by the roar of the flames, the smell of burning chemicals, the sound of a rival's legacy turning to ash. Arthur closes his eyes. The boy from the Bronx wanted to be a king, but he forgot. Kings often end their reign on a scaffold. The car moves into the dark heart of the city. The summit is behind him. The abyss is all that remains. Chapter 2. The Black Seeds. The mahogany desk was polished to a mirror shine. It was the kind of desk men died to sit behind, in the heart of Chase, Manhattan. Arthur Vance looked at his name engraved on a brass plate. Vice President. He had the suit, the title, the steady pulse of a generous salary. But it felt like a cage, a golden, suffocating cage. Arthur stood up. He did not look back. He walked past the rows of glowing computer screens and men in gray ties. He handed his resignation to a manager who didn't even look up. 10 minutes later, he was on the street. The air of the city tasted like exhaust and ambition. Most men would call him a fool. Arthur knew better. He had spent months in the dusty corners of the public library. He wasn't looking for stock tips. He was looking for a miracle. He found it in a faded scientific journal, a report buried under technical jargon. It spoke of a forgotten strain of grain, Sorghum-X. It didn't need the rain. It thrived in the heat that killed everything else. It was a plant designed for a world that was getting thirstier. Arthur took every cent he had, his savings, his small pension, the money he had hidden in shoeboxes. He traveled west, to the parched, cracked earth of the Midwest. He bought land that the locals called the Dust Bowl's ghost, thousands of acres of dirt that looked like ash. The sellers laughed when they signed the deeds. They thought they were robbing a city boy blind. Then, the sky went dry. One season without rain turned into two. Two turned into a decade. The great American corn belt began to wither. Green stalks turned to brown skeletons. Farmers wept over empty wells. But on Arthur's land, something was happening. A sea of deep, violent purple. Sorghum-X was rising. It drank the sun and ignored the drought. Suddenly, Arthur Vance was no longer a fool. He was the only man with a harvest. The phone call started at dawn. The government, the shipping giants, the international food brokers. They didn't just want his grain. They needed it. Arthur watched the numbers in his bank account grow. 6 figures, 7, 8. He became a multi-millionaire before the first frost. But wealth was just the beginning. The hunger in his belly from the Bronx had never truly gone away. It had only changed shape. He didn't want to just sell grain. He wanted to own the ground it grew in, the trucks that carried it, the silos that stored it. He wanted the world to ask him for permission to eat, to the public. He was a hero. The cameras captured him in the Bronx, standing in front of a new community center. He poured millions into the streets that had once tried to break him. He shook hands with grandmothers and kissed babies. The headlines called him the people's billionaire, a man of the soil, a man of the heart. But the shadow was growing, behind the oak doors of his new headquarters. Arthur was a different man. He found legal loopholes in ancient land grants. He used predatory pricing to drive the price of seeds so low his competitors went bankrupt. When the small family farms were at their weakest, he moved in. He bought their legacies for pennies on the dollar if they refused to sell. He bought the water rights to the land next door. He choked them out, silently, legally, ruthlessly. The final piece of the puzzle lay in Chicago, the city of wind and steel. Arthur walked into a private club where the walls were lined with leather books and the scent of history. At the back table sat a man with eyes like flint. Marcus Thorne. Thorne owned the rails. He owned the veins of the country. The two men stared at each other. No words were needed. They were two predators recognizing their own kind. Arthur extended his hand. His grip was firm, cold. Thorne took it. The handshake was a pact, a silent agreement to carve up the world between them, outside. The sun set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, jagged shadows. The black seeds had been planted. The harvest of blood and gold was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Deadliest Game. The golden age of the partnership was over. The handshake in Chicago had turned into a stranglehold, high above the clouds, in a private jet crossing the Great Plains. Arthur Vance looked at a spreadsheet. The numbers were red, deep, bleeding red, in a single week. $500 million had vanished. It was not a market crash. It was not a bad harvest. It was Marcus Thorne. The veteran power broker had stopped playing by the rules of the gentleman. Thorne had spent decades weaving a web of political favors in Washington and the West. With one phone call, he had paralyzed the railway lines. Arthur's shipments of Sorghum-X were sitting in the desert heat, rotting in stationary steel cars, while the world waited for grain. Marcus Thorne was smiling in his boardroom. Arthur felt something break inside him. It was not fear. It was a cold, dark awakening. For years, he had played the game of legal loopholes and predatory pricing. He had fought with pens and contracts. But Thorne had used the weight of the state to crush him. The humiliation tasted like ash in his mouth. If the boardroom is a cage, then I will go to the jungle, he whispered to the empty cabin. He did not call his lawyers. He did not call his PR team. He made a single call to a burner phone. The meeting took place in a windowless diner on the edge of Gary, Indiana. The man sitting across from him was named Leo. Leo did not look like a criminal. He looked like a shadow. He had a military posture and eyes that had seen things no man should describe. Leo was a specialist in crisis management, but not the kind involving press releases. His work involved friction, pressure, and silence. I want the railways to move, Arthur said. His voice was flat, like a stone hitting a frozen lake. Leo nodded slowly. Movement requires a catalyst, he replied. Arthur slid a thick envelope across the grease-stained table. Make Marcus Thorne feel the heat. The sabotage began with surgical precision. First, it was the signal boxes. Electronic ghosts began to haunt Thorne's network. Trains were diverted to nowhere. Engines stalled in the middle of mountain passes. Then, the friction became physical. Arthur stood on the balcony of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. It was midnight. The city was a quilt of dark buildings and streetlights. He held a pair of high-powered binoculars to his eyes. He focused on the industrial docks 5 miles away. A massive warehouse, bearing the Thorne Logistics logo, sat quietly by the water. Then, the night fractured. A silent bloom of orange light expanded from the center of the warehouse. A second later, the shockwave hit, a dull, heavy thud that rattled the glass of Arthur's balcony. The warehouse turned into a pillar of fire. Millions of dollars in Thorne's inventory went up in a beautiful, terrible roar. Arthur did not flinch. He watched the flames reflect in the lenses of his binoculars. The demon in his soul was finally at peace. But the fire was not enough. Marcus Thorne did not back down. He doubled the pressure. He used his ties to launch a federal investigation into Arthur's land holdings. The war was no longer about money. It was about survival. Arthur summoned Leo to his estate. The property was sprawling, green, perfect. But Arthur felt exposed. He looked at a photo of Thorne in the morning paper. Thorne was laughing, unscathed. "Send a permanent message," Arthur said. His hands were steady now. "I want him to know that nowhere is safe. Make it look like a tragedy of the road." A week later, the news broke. A black sedan carrying Marcus Thorne had been forced off a rain-slicked highway in Virginia. A heavy truck had clipped the rear, sending the sedan tumbling down a steep embankment. The truck did not stop. The driver was never found. Arthur sat in his study. The television was on mute. The images showed the twisted metal of Thorne's car. The report said Marcus Thorne had survived, but he was critically injured. Both legs shattered, internal damage, a long, dark road to recovery. The business rivalry was dead. In its place, a blood feud had been born. The victory felt heavy. The air in the room seemed to grow thick with ghosts. Arthur began to look at the corners of his ceiling. He began to wonder if his own security team was truly loyal. He spent millions more, not on grain, not on bridges. He turned his estate into a high-tech fortress. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, armed guards in civilian clothes. He stopped sleeping without a light on. He had won the deadliest game, but the prize was a prison of his own making. He was a king behind bulletproof glass, waiting for the shadow that he knew was coming for him. Chapter 4. Betrayal and the Hunt. The air in the library was thick with the scent of old paper and paranoia. Arthur Vance sat behind his desk. He was a man who owned the horizon. Yet, he felt like he was being watched by the very shadows he had created. The relationship with Leo had changed. It was no longer a partnership of silence. It was a transaction of fear. Leo sat across from him. He did not look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a ghost with a heavy secret. He placed a small, silver digital recorder on the mahogany surface. The silence between them stretched, a long, tense wire ready to snap. "I need 10 million, Leo said. His voice was a low hum, devoid of respect. Arthur felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. "I paid you for the Chicago job. I paid you for the accident." Leo leaned forward. The light caught the scars on his knuckles. "You paid for my work. Now you are paying for my memory." He tapped the recorder. "There are voices on here. Arthur, voices that sound like a king ordering a hit." Arthur realized in that moment he had fed a wolf, and the wolf was no longer satisfied with scraps. Over the next few months, millions vanished. Wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, payments to blind trusts in Switzerland. Every time Leo called, Arthur's heart skipped a beat. The billionaire was being bled dry, not by a market crash, but by a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The panic began to rot Arthur's logic. He was a titan of industry. He was not a man who took orders. He decided to fix the problem. One final time, he did not call a shadow like Leo. He went deeper into the underworld. He hired a team of mercenaries, men who had no history with him, men who were paid to be ghosts. "Eliminate the problem," Arthur told them. His voice was a frantic whisper in a dark parking garage. No trace, no memory, just silence. The hunt began on a rainy Tuesday night. Leo was smart. He felt the air change before the first shot was fired. He slipped out of his apartment in Jersey City just as the door was kicked in. The chase moved through the Narrow. Oil-slicked alleys of New Jersey. The sound of heavy boots echoed against damp brick walls. Leo ran with the desperation of a man who knew his time was up. He was fast, but the mercenaries were faster. They cornered him near the docks. The smell of salt and rotting wood filled the air. Leo was wounded, a crimson stain spreading across his shoulder. He leaned against a rusted shipping container. He knew he would not see the sunrise, but he had one final move. A small, padded envelope was already in his hand. He had spent the last hour moving from mailbox to mailbox. He slipped the envelope into a blue postal box just as the shadow fell over him. A flash of cold steel, a heavy, wet sound. Leo fell to the pavement. The rain washed his blood into the gutter. The mercenaries searched his body. They found nothing. They disappeared into the night, believing the job was done. Arthur received the news in his study. The problem is gone. The voice on the phone said. Arthur let out a breath he felt he had been holding for years. The weight lifted. He felt the blood return to his face. He was safe. The recordings were surely gone with the man. He convinced himself that the ghost had been exorcised. A few months passed. Arthur appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine. The headline read, "The Unstoppable King of Commodities." He looked magnificent. A triumphant smile, a sharp suit, a gaze that commanded the world. He was back at the summit. He began to sleep again. He even started planning a new expansion into the European markets. The world was his once more. Across the river, in a sterile, quiet office, a young federal prosecutor sat alone. His name was David Miller. He was a man who believed in the letter of the law. He did not care for billionaires. He did not care for fame. On his desk sat a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a small, encrypted hard drive. It had taken his tech team weeks to crack the code. David put on his headphones. He clicked the final file. The room was silent, except for the scratching of a pen on a notepad. Then, the audio began to play. The quality was crisp, cold. David leaned back, his face turning to stone. It was Arthur Vance's voice, unmistakable, clear as a bell. The voice said, "Make him disappear, permanently." David Miller stopped the recording. He looked out the window at the distant glow of Vance Tower. The hunt was not over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Gavel of Justice. The air inside the federal courtroom was stagnant. It smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the cold sweat of a fallen titan. Arthur Vance sat at the defense table. He looked smaller than he did on the covers of the magazines. The sharp lines of his suit could not hide the sag in his shoulders. Behind him, the gallery was packed with journalists, former associates, and the curious public. They had come to watch a god bleed. The lead defense attorney stood up. His voice was a polished instrument of persuasion. He spoke for hours about deep fakes. He spoke about the terrifying power of artificial intelligence to mimic a human soul. These recordings, Your Honor, are a digital ghost, he claimed. He paced the floor, pointing at the hard drive on the evidence table. They are a fabrication, designed to bring down a man who built this city. The attorney's voice was confident, smooth. It was the sound of $1 million at work. Arthur did not listen. He was watching the witness stand. One by one, they took the oath. The men who had shared his scotch, the partners who had signed the Chicago contracts, the friends who had toasted his health at the Hamptons. They did not look at him. They kept their eyes fixed on the prosecutor. Their voices were thin, trembling with the fear of being dragged down with him. They spoke of late-night calls. They spoke of the atmosphere of terror that followed the warehouse fire. Each testimony was a brick, building a wall that was closing in on Arthur. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the prosecutor prepared to play the final tape. Suddenly, the screech of a chair legs against the floor broke the quiet. Arthur Vance stood up. His lawyer stopped mid-sentence, staring at his client in shock. "Arthur, sit down," the lawyer whispered. Arthur ignored him. He looked directly at the judge, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen every lie in the book. "Your Honor," Arthur said. His voice was not the rasp of a defeated man. It was the clear, commanding tone of the boardroom. "Stop the charade." The lawyer tried to grab his arm. Arthur brushed him away. "The recordings are real." The room erupted. The judge hammered her gavel, the sound like gunshots in the small space. "Silence," she roared. Arthur waited for the quiet to return. "I am guilty of the pride that built my empire," he said. "I am guilty of the anger that sought to protect it, but I am also a man of means. The world is suffering. Our bridges are crumbling. Our people are hungry. I possess $80 billion in liquid assets. Oil and grain, I offer it all, every cent, every share, every acre. I propose a total forfeiture to the United States, for national infrastructure, for global relief. Let my life's work serve the people I once ignored. In exchange, I ask for a path to restitution, not a cage." A collective gasp swept through the room. 80 billion. The number was so large it felt imaginary. The journalist scrambled to type the words. For a moment, the courtroom felt like a marketplace. The tension was thick. Would the law bend for a mountain of gold? The judge leaned forward. She did not look at the lawyers. She did not look at the gallery. She looked into Arthur's eyes. "Mr. Vance," she began. Her voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You speak of your fortune as if it were a shield. You offer to fix the roads and feed the hungry. But the law is not a business transaction. The safety of our citizens, the sanctity of a human life. These things are not for sale. American justice is not a commodity to be bargained for with zeros and commas. If I accept your gold as a bribe for your freedom, then the law itself becomes a hollow shell." Arthur felt the floor beneath him turn to ice. The judge picked up her pen. "For the crimes of conspiracy, sabotage, and the orchestration of violence, I sentence you to 20 years in federal prison. There will be no parole, no early release. Your assets will be seized, not as a gift from you, but as a penalty for your actions. The funds will be used to compensate the families you ruined and the victims of your greed." The gavel came down. The sound was final. A door slamming shut on a life of luxury. Federal marshals stepped forward. They did not handle him with the respect of a billionaire. They grabbed his arms. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut over his wrists. The same wrists that had worn watches worth more than a common man's home. As they led him through the side door. The gallery was a sea of noise, but Arthur heard none of it. He did not look angry. He did not look sad. His eyes were wide open, but they were filled with a terrifying, hollow emptiness. The summit was gone. The gold was gone. He was finally just a man. And the silence of the cell was waiting for him. Chapter 6. Dawn in Cell Block 4. The morning sun filtered through a high, barred window in the prison library. It was not the warm, golden light of a Manhattan penthouse. It was a pale, dust-mottled beam that touched the spines of old books. Arthur Vance sat at a wooden table. The silk suits were long gone. Now, he wore a coarse, blue denim uniform with a number stenciled over his heart. His hair, once a sharp, powerful silver, was now thin and white as a winter cloud. His hands, once busy signing billion-dollar contracts, were calloused from cleaning shelves. In this quiet corner, he was no longer the sovereign of Wall Street. To the guards and the other men in blue, he was simply Mr. Vance. A young man sat across from him. His skin was marked with the tattoos of a life spent in the streets. The boy struggled to read a basic sentence in a law textbook. "Take your time," Arthur said. His voice was no longer a bark of command. It was a gentle, patient murmur. Words are the only walls you can actually break down between the lessons. Arthur often sat in silence. The ghosts of his past did not scream anymore. They whispered. He thought of his mother. He remembered her standing over a steaming wash basin in the Bronx. Her back was bent. Her hands were raw from the lie. She had looked at him one evening, a long, long time ago. "Money is just a tool." "Arthur," she had said, "it is a shovel or a hammer, but it is never a soul." He had spent 40 years proving her wrong, only to find out, in the quiet of a cell, that she was the only one who was right. Arthur spent his nights on his narrow cot, writing in the same tattered notebook he had saved from his tower. He was not plotting a new merger. He was drafting a blueprint. He called it the redemptive seed. It was a plan for a sustainable education fund, one that would not just build buildings, but would nourish the minds of children in the neighborhoods he had forgotten. He used his knowledge of the markets to design a trust that would last a century. He was planting a harvest he would never live to see. One afternoon, a guard tapped on the library glass. "Vance, you have a visitor." Arthur was confused. His lawyers had stopped coming years ago. His fair-weather friends had vanished like smoke in a breeze. He walked into the visiting room. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and regret. On the other side of the thick glass sat an old man in a wheelchair. It was Marcus Thorne. The former Titan looked fragile. A blanket covered his legs, the legs that had been shattered on a rain-slicked highway. The two men stared at each other for a long time. The silence was a bridge over a river of blood and fire. Thorne picked up the telephone handset. Arthur did the same. "I heard you were teaching," Thorne said. His voice was weak, rasping through an oxygen tube. Arthur nodded slowly. "I am learning more than I am teaching." "Marcus." Thorne looked at the scars on his own hands, then back at the man who had ordered the strike. The hate was gone. It had been burned away by time and the cold reality of mortality. "We were so small," Thorne whispered. "Even with all those billions, we were so very small." Arthur pressed his palm against the glass. Thorne placed his hand over the same spot on the other side. They stayed like that for a minute. Two old lions, watching the sun go down. The feud was over. There was only the peace of the forgiven. Arthur walked back to his cell that evening with a strange lightness in his chest. He looked at the iron bars, at the stone walls. He realized a terrifying truth. These 20 years in prison were the only time he had been truly free. Free from the hunger that never ended. Free from the fear of losing what he had stolen. Free from the chains of his own ambition. God had not given him the kingdom he wanted, but he had given him the peace he needed. Years passed, in a world outside the walls. A young boy in the Bronx stood before a set of massive iron gates. They were the gates of the university Arthur Vance had once attended. The boy held a letter in his hand. It was a Vance scholarship. He was the first in his family to ever step onto a campus. He looked at the name on the letter. He didn't know about the towers, or the fires, or the trials. He only knew that a man he would never meet had given him a future. Back in the prison yard. It was a day of extreme heat. The soil was dry and cracked. Nothing grew in the shadow of the watchtower. Arthur Vance stood by the fence, looking down at the dirt. There, pushing through the gray dust, was a single green sprout. It was Sorghum-X. A seed must have been carried by the wind or dropped by a passing bird. It was small, but it was strong. It didn't need the rain. It thrived in the hardship. Arthur looked at the sprout. Then he looked up at the vast, blue sky. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. The harvest was finally beginning. Arthur's journey reminds us that the road to success is built with years of sacrifice and grit. Yet, as we have seen, a single moment of pride or a solitary step outside the path of integrity can turn an empire into dust. Let us walk our paths with clarity, acting always with kindness and staying true to the laws that bind us together. If this story touched your heart, please join our community by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps these tales of the human spirit live on. Please click the video appearing on your screen now to discover our latest story.